depression, anxiety, busyness, loneliness, fear, worry, envy, loss of a child, loss of an adult child, loss of a spouse. Now we get to loss of a job. The final weeks, week 45 through 52, we'll be looking at fruit of the Spirit and the various characteristics and traits of the fruit of the Spirit. And we will then close out this study. And so as we think about loss of a job, let's just begin by asking the question, and then we'll go through some of the lessons for this week. Several good points were made, and I'll highlight some of those. Maybe you have some comments on them, and then we'll dive in a little deeper on the topic. But let's start with just, what is a job? Let's just, nuts and bolts, let's break it down. What is a job? So when you think of a job, when you think of how a job is defined historically, when you think of even a job throughout the Scripture, what is a job? Okay, so it is a way to support yourself, your family, so a means of income, a means of support. What else? Okay, so it's maybe not, and I think it's important to make this distinction now. It's maybe different things to different people, in the sense that there are some who may look at a job, nuts and bolts, very black and white. Hey, I work, I make money. That's how I see it. I don't care about it. Doesn't matter to me. It's irrelevant. It's a means to make an income and a means for support. Maybe there's a dose of I'd like to enjoy it, and it's something I'd like to apply myself fully in, but that's not of concern to me. From a weighted matter, it's just a way to make money. Others may view it more heavily from the weight of, hey, I want to love what I do. I want to wake up and yearn to be at work or in my job, and I thrive in it. I long for it. It is my calling or my purpose or my application of abilities in a way that fulfills me more holistically. And yeah, maybe I'd like to make some money. And I think we can think of examples in both categories where there are extremes, obviously. But those are some two good responses. What does a job do? What does a job do? What does it achieve? What are some other areas? Maybe for you personally, or again, historically, or you could speak to others. What does a job do? What does it achieve? Okay. Okay. Sure. So, in a way, something to do, but also something to do where there are relationships, where you're able to build a network, you're able to find meaning with those relationships. Okay? Very good. Very good. Anything else? Go ahead. Okay. Sure. 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 So it can be a channel or it can be a conduit to freedom from maybe locale. I think about certain pockets within the country that we've traveled. There's like small towns, for example. Just historically, it's been the case that folks have maybe been reared in that area. They've then gone and done maybe farming or agriculture or whatever's typically done in that town. Not many folks leave that town, and then all of a sudden, maybe there's one or two billboards in the whole town, and one of them will be, join the Marines, see the world. So to your point, maybe someone is accessing that job for the intent to maybe aspire toward other personal interests and other means that they could maybe not achieve otherwise. What else? Anything else? Say it again. Accomplishments. So feel good, a sense of value, a sense of a self-worth. There is benefit to performing a task and then receiving the reinforcement or the reward for doing that task. And it allows you to have a certain sense of self-worth, certain self-esteem that becomes present because of that. Go ahead. Yeah. Amen. Right. His workmanship. Right. Right. That sounds like a sermon, brother. That's a good one. That's a very good one, right? I've never heard that before. That's excellent. God providing law, God providing labor, God providing love, and you think also in the context there, it's paradise, right? It's the Garden of Eden. Sin had not yet entered. Sometimes I think we get this idea that work is beneath us, and if you're somehow in a position where you don't have to work, then somehow you're really living the good life, because who wants to work? It's like, well, wait a second. God's created us in a certain way that to do work is valuable. It is helpful. It is not something that we should shun or try to avoid. Now, obviously, after sin entered, what did God say was going to happen regarding that work? Just to kind of round this out and make sure we're clear. I don't know what it would have been in the Garden of Eden, because we don't really get that description. But obviously, after sin entered, God said the consequences, not only for leaving the garden, but also notice here, Genesis chapter 3 and verse 17, and unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. And so, again, not sure exactly what the context would have been prior to this, but there are many times when I'm attempting to do something handy that I usually am bumbling and fumbling with, failing in, having sweat dripping from my brow, frustrated, learning the value of patience and the value of being calm and gentle-spirited in those moments. And I'm reminded of Adam. And I'm reminded of this verse. And so, yes, work at times can indeed be challenging and be difficult. Any other comments or thoughts here on just what is a job? Go ahead. Sure, sure. Being productive, sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's a very good phrase there, being productive, because your job may be something where there's no income. I tell my wife she should earn a wage of about $1 billion a year, but everything she does is for free. So is she doing a job? Well, yes, she's being productive, but yet she's not technically actually earning a wage. So all of this matters, especially when you start looking at it from that lens, because then you start to venture into what I call the empty nest challenge, where you really start to struggle with meaning, you start to struggle with purpose. Why? Because these young ones that you've now been raising for 20-something years have now left the house, and what is that likened unto? Is it not likened unto losing a job? Now all of a sudden, the work that you've been engaged in, day out, night in, night out, has now left the house. So what then do you struggle with? I think that's relevant here to this study. Any other thoughts? Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Sure. 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 Correct. Sure. Right. Sure. 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 And I think that's also speaking again to something that's lost when a job is lost. You lose that sense of being disciplined, being shaped, being molded because of the challenges that come with work. Yes, in the moment, you don't really like the sweat of your brow. You don't like the pain and the difficulty. But what happens, and all of us can attest to this who have been in the workforce for any time, after years of learning how to grind through that, what do you learn to do? You learn to really value it. You learn to see, wow, I've actually been made a better person. I have become more fortified, become more disciplined. I've sharpened my skill set, my capabilities, and I've learned to really appreciate the value and the output of what this difficulty has actually produced. And when you lose that, when that goes away, that's hard. That's another aspect that's lost. Now you've lost kind of this training regimen, this discipline, this benefit that comes with a job. All right? So let's talk about how a job, yeah, go ahead, Nick, and then we'll go on. Yeah, yeah, sure, sure, sure. Yeah, sure, it'd be different. Sure, absolutely. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm, mm. Right, 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 right. Sure, sure, sure. And that word reputation is a piece of this as well because it's not a job and opportunity to serve as a Christian and to be a light. I mean, and to your point, Nick, when the system starts to break you down and you start to get grinded through and filtered through the system, you start to ask some really hard questions because your whole perspective shifts And then you start to wrestle with, well, wait a second, what is a job? What am I doing? What am I trying to do? And to be able to kind of anchor back to, wait a second, this is just another channel and another way in which I can glorify God, serve Him, and be a light. Whatever that means. That may mean having to tough it out through the bureaucracy. That may mean, hey, you know what? This is not a proper application of my skills. There's another way for me to apply my skills to glorify God. But to get to that question, the faster you can get there, probably the easier life will be, because you realize, hey, you know what? This isn't about me gaining prominence. This isn't about me, to your point, Nick, you reach a certain point in your career and you, quote, have enough, but have you had enough yet? And so maybe you start to question, why do I keep going? Why do I stay in this? Or if you're young, I don't really want to make all this money, so what is it for? When you really boil it down to, wait a second, how am I serving God? How am I applying myself in order to glorify God? And what are all the aspects of this job that I can break down and I can actually see, wait a second, I'm not maybe serving tacos or taking an order or, checking on a customer. Wait a second, this is an interaction and an opportunity for me through my conversation, through my words, through the way I behave, my tone, to actually let my light shine and potentially provoke someone to contemplate their relationship with God. We had an instructor at Memphis that used to talk about personal work and how brethren don't need to get beat down and think that because they're not going out doing personal work and knocking on doors every day that somehow they're not evangelizing. And I think there's a lot there that we don't recognize. We have an opportunity to evangelize every single day. As a matter of fact, if you break down Mark chapter 16, 15, and 16, Christ is not saying, go hop planes and hop on boats and get in cars and drive everywhere and fly everywhere and go everywhere to bring the gospel. The breakdown of that verse is actually, everywhere you are going, preach the gospel. Everywhere you go in the world, bring the gospel with you. So I have a question. Does that include work? Absolutely. And so obviously if you lose a job, you then have to kind of reevaluate, well, wait a second. What do I do now? Where do I go? Right? Any other thoughts or comments? Yes, sir.
Recently, I had an opportunity. Nothing coming around in our industry. I caught myself saying this. Main thing I want to encourage you to do, figure out what really drives you. Line yourself up.
Mm-hmm.
Our industry is definitely service. Service. Probably.
Mm-hmm.
We help.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also, I caught myself saying, treat this as if it's a
Mm-hmm.
make decision. Tell my son, little guy,
Mm-hmm.
and go to your career. I don't make decisions. Yours.
Mm-hmm.
People separate, have influence. Most work.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. A sense of ownership to the work, to the role, to the overall effort and mission in terms of that team process. And your comments there about, finding what you're good at, finding what you enjoy, finding your personality and making application to it. I want you to think about, let's go ahead and go here. Obviously, we were going to hit this passage. So this is probably a good segue. If someone could read for me, and you could take turns, it is lengthy. Matthew 25, 14 through 30. Matthew 25, 14 through 30.
For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country, who called his own servants, whether it was good to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his own ability. And immediately he went on a journey. Then he who had received 5 talents went and traded with them, and made another 5. Likewise he who had received 2 came to him he who had one hid his Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord came and so he who had received 5 Lord, you delivered to me 5 look, I have made 5 The Lord told him, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many. Enter into the joy of your Lord. He also who had received 2 talents came and said, Lord, you delivered to me 2 talents. Look, I have made 4 talents and 5 talents. The Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. Ruler over many. Enter into the joy of the Lord. Then he who had received 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed. I was afraid, and went to see your talent. Look, there you have what you have. But his Lord answered him and said to him, wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown, gather where I have not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bank, and the money could own with you. Therefore take the talent from him, and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given. He will have abundance. Even what he has, away. Ask the unprofitable servant for his charge. There will be weeping.
All right, so thank you, brother, so much. So, in respect to our modern society and various pockets of fluency in this country, the access that we have to so many different types of jobs, so many different forms of education, the ease we have of provisions in many respects in this country compared to countries throughout the world. You can not work a day in your life and be provided for in this country. It's very possible. Then why work? Why pursue a job? Exactly like what Jurgen was saying and like what many of the rest of you have said, an application of abilities, an application of who you are, who you were made to be, not in the sense that that is achieved and 100% identified in your work, because it's not, but it's a channel. It's a way in which that is tapped into and applied. Here we have a passage that is concerning. We have a passage, one of the passages in Scripture that really causes me to sweat. Because God makes it clear here, He expects a product. He expects output. He expects what He's put in to be returned with additional value or additional interest. In other words, I am a created being by God, and when I return to Him, what have I done? Now again, we got to be careful, because that doesn't mean, well, if I made a lot of money, that means I did it. No, not necessarily. That's not the lens in which God judges and the way in which He views us. How have I applied who I am for God's glory? Not based upon the check amount received, but based upon what it is I'm producing in my life. And that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be an actual paying job. It just means, am I applying myself as fully as possible to the glory of God? And a job may be a means in which to achieve that. Those of you who are older, have you ever noticed, and I know the answer is yes, this is rhetorical, a younger person who has all this energy, all this spark, all this intellect, the world at their fingertips. And you look back and remember the days when you maybe can recall you kind of had that. and you wrestle with why that young person, given everything you know now, older in life, isn't applying, what do we say, their full potential. That's frustrating as an older person, isn't it? Well, imagine God. Imagine God. Okay? God created us. He knows who we are. So we as older people, knowing that feeling, knowing what that's like, contemplate how God is now communicating this to us. He knows what we're capable of. And when we don't go out and aspire toward that, we see the outcome right here in Matthew chapter 25. And so when you think about losing a job, in view of that, think about now losing a job. Now everything's comes into question. Now you really start to question, wait a second, I was going down this route. I thought this was a way in which to serve God. I thought this was a way in which to have community, to apply myself, to be who I'm capable of being, to earn a wage, to provide, to find purpose and meaning, and now it's gone. On top of that, we're not even really, we don't have time to get into this. How do you feel? Especially if you've been fired or let go. How do you feel? Sure. Sure. Yes. Amen. As a Christian, you can contextualize it a little bit and you're able to pray about it. You're able to see it in the bigger picture. But nonetheless, the grief, and I've known of some who have cried for weeks because they felt betrayed. They felt lied to. They found out afterward that the system knew it was going to happen maybe for 6 months. And it wasn't anything of their own doing. They were just the lowest on the totem pole, or they were the ones that received the chopping block. And that's damaging. That is very difficult to bear. I saw a couple hands, so let me pause for a second. Go ahead. Mm. 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 Right. Right. Mm. Mm. Right. Right. So I think you're saying the commodity that we evaluate this on should really be time. And I've heard others say this as well. Scott Illy, actually, and I don't think he'd oppose to me saying this at all. I think he'd probably want it to be said. Scott Illy, when he was trying to figure out his mission work efforts, basically said, and he boiled it down to this, very capable, smart person, MBA from Emory, extremely successful in the business world, him and Alexis both. And he said, I'm trying to figure out how to maximize the time that I have in applying what I'm capable of to further the gospel. And I thought that's just fascinating. I mean, really, if you think about being a Christian and whatever capabilities or talents or abilities we have, to contemplate everything from that lens, you're saying I have a certain amount of time, and in that time, how can I maximize my capabilities to live and spread the gospel through my life going through this process? That really changes the dynamic as to how we look at this. And it takes out all the other aspects that the world likes to consider. Any other comments? I thought maybe there was another hand or so. No? Okay. All right, so in our final 2 minutes here, we're talking about losing the job. So here's a question. Just because the daily punch in and punch out has ended, does our work have to end? I think we've already answered that. But here's what I mean by that. And to Tressa's point about grief, it's not that we're not going to grieve, but when we rise that first morning, when we would typically go into our job, what makes us different as a Christian as to what we can do compared to those who root their entire existence on making that money and having that physical work? Correct. You have something to do, right? And again, maybe that's prayer. Maybe that's, you know what? I'm going to cry over this because this hurts. And the first thing I'm going to do when I can't go into that job, I'm going to set aside time to just pray. I'm going to set aside time to study the Bible and learn more about my value, my self-worth, and what I mean to God. How much He values me. Then maybe I begin to shift and I begin to find opportunities as to how I can serve in His kingdom. And maybe I also say, you know what, I've lost this job, but to Tressa's point, some people bounce right back. What is one of the ways that they do that? Hey, you know what? The job's been lost. It is what it is. Now it's time for me to do what? Look for another job. I know some people who, when they lose a job or they've been let go, will then spend the time that they spent in the former job working on applying and trying to pursue another job. In other words, if they worked 8 to 5, they will then spend 8 to 5 looking for a job. And there's value in that because not only are you putting forth the effort and doing something to try to assist in addressing the problem, but you're also not losing the habit of what? Work. You're still engaged in some form of work. Any other final comments or thoughts on this topic? Mm-hmm. You don't know how you're going to all on you. Mm-hmm. And who is fighting for soul fighter when it happens, devastation is very tough. Mm-hmm. Don't God fall back. God provide through your work, through your hands. And there's mm-hmm. God provide. Mm-hmm. Maybe it means you need to attack. Always have God. Mm-hmm. And you as a provider, not about mm-hmm. God. It's mm-hmm. about you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Sure, and we're going to get into this obviously throughout the day to a degree, especially the provision piece. And one of the things that I think we can challenge ourselves in, because that's the real situation, what Larry just described. Not that the others aren't real, but the pinnacle of the challenge is I think well defined there. And that is, in that process, how is that home being provided for? Here's what I mean, and I thought this was a very, very, very well stated comment here about love in the lessons this week. Our society, and even too many in the church, seem to believe that love means making sure someone never has a time of challenge. Isn't that how we define love as a society? I've known of several grandmas and grandpas who think, well, I don't want my children and my grandchildren to ever be in need of one of anything, and so they think that in order to love them, they have to literally give them every single thing they possibly can. And he's pushing back on that thought. Our society defines love that way, and then he's actually correlating that to God, allowing us to suffer through challenges and to grow from them. The context that really boils down the pinnacle of the challenge that Larry described. How is the home being provided for in that situation? Here's a question. Those children that are present, that are experiencing the reality of that moment, to be walked through, communicated with, for the family to pray together in that context, those children are learning something that can never be learned in having a stable, well-paying job throughout their entire upbringing. They are learning the process via the head of the home, who as a godly man is training and showing them in the process of him experiencing it in his real life, how to cope in a godly manner and navigate through such a challenge. That's powerful. You can't manufacture that. What an opportunity then for those children, and what comfort then those parents have as those children then go out into the world to say, you know what, if they lose a job, that they've gone through that before. Of course, it's easier to laugh at it after it's all over. But what a comfort to be able to realize that in the moment. Thank you all very much for the class.